Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mandeep Dhaliwal. I'm the director of the HIV and Health Group at the United Nations Development Program, and it is my great pleasure today, on the day at the HLPF where SDG 16 is being discussed, to introduce to you Justice Edwin Cameron. He's a judge of the South African Constitutional Court. He has a long and illustrious career in human rights, HIV, and casting a light on the inequalities that affect sustainable development. He is the recipient of numerous awards. He was named by Nelson Mandela as one of the new heroes of South Africa, one of the great legal minds of our time. He has received the Nelson Mandela Award for Health and Human Rights. He has been instrumental in securing the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in the South African Constitution and delivered many important judgments on issues of advancing human rights jurisprudence. He is now, as I said, on the South African Constitutional Court. His career began in 1986 as a human rights lawyer at the University of Witwatersrand. As a Center for Applied Studies. He wrote one of the first charters on HIV and AIDS and co-founded the AIDS Consortium, one of the first non-governmental organizations working on AIDS in South Africa. And he was the first director of the AIDS Law Project. His work on HIV, human rights, has been an inspiration to many around the world. I've had the pleasure of knowing Justice Cameron since 1996. And he has inspired many, many people and continues to through his legal work and his activism on issues of HIV and human rights. And without much further ado, this is the nicest thing I've had to do all month. I'm so happy to do this, to introduce to you my good friend, Justice Edwin Cameron.
Thank you, Mandeep. And no time for self-congratulation, but I do appreciate the generosity of your introduction. Serious business, ladies and gentlemen. The Sustainable Development Goal 16 cuts across a wide range of issues, includes prevention of violence, equality before the law, access to justice, accessible public services, fundamental freedoms, participation, and above all, non-discrimination. I want to underscore here today the importance of understanding and critically assessing the role that the criminal law plays in excluding people from society and in making it impossible to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 16. I have one simple message. If we don't understand how damaging the criminal law can be, then we will leave the most vulnerable people behind. As Mandeep has said, I have the privilege to serve on my country's highest court. We in South Africa have learnt very painfully from history the importance of strong, inclusive, transparent, and incorruptible institutions. We have learned to value an empowered civil society. We have learned to rate highly the importance of protections against discrimination, having come from a past that was severely disfigured by discrimination on grounds of race and gender. Most of all, I see the effect of long-standing patterns of discrimination and exclusion and of discriminatory laws and policies that still persist in our country. Our representative yesterday at the session on Sustainable Development Goal 10 was speaking about the lingering effects of many decades and even centuries of legal exclusions which still linger years after they were formally abolished. This type of exclusionary legal persecution damages people, creates and enhances divisions and inequalities, and has flow-on effects on other goals like health, eradication of poverty, inequalities, including gender inequality, housing, work, and education. One of the targets in SDG 16 is to promote and enforce non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. It is the key to leaving no one behind, and it should be the golden thread that runs through the entire agenda. But here's the point, ladies and gentlemen, it's almost entirely absent from discussions. When it comes to discriminatory laws, criminal laws are the harshest, most acute form of discrimination and inequality. Discriminatory criminal laws that target people based on their sexual orientation, I speak with personal knowledge of that as a proudly and openly gay man, gender identity, drug use, or those that criminalize sex work, or adolescents exploring their sexuality with each other, an issue on which the court on which I sit a few years ago struck down a criminal prohibition on youngsters under 16 having sexually exploratory contact with each other, or women making reproductive health decisions. All these laws do leave people behind, but they do more than that. They actively push them down and back. They are an unjust, irrational targeting and persecution of people through the criminal law. 69 countries, sadly, the majority of them on my own, or at least half of them on my own beautiful continent of Africa, still criminalize same-sex sexual activity. Over 100 countries criminalize drug use or personal possession of drugs. And almost all countries have some form of criminal prohibition on sex work. 1 in 5 people in prison worldwide is there because of drug-related crimes, and 80% of those people are there for personal use. Perhaps you think this is a small issue, doesn't affect many people. It is not correct. 271 million people used drugs in 2017. And again, with sexual orientation and gender identity, around about 5% of all societies, all sectors, all cultures, everywhere in the world are same-sex oriented, identifies that, and another 5% may not so identify or may be partially along the scale of gender diversity or sexual orientation. Against all of these groups, criminalization has severe consequences. They take people outside the areas of protection. They declare their actions or their identity illegitimate. They increase stigma. They exclude them from protections that our judicial, social, and economic systems may provide. This affects their access to health services, to housing, education, social protection, and employment, with obvious consequences for a range of the SDGs. Let us take an example from the HIV response, something that's close to my heart as someone who is living with HIV and who has had the privilege of surviving the epidemic because of access to antiretroviral treatment. We know that criminalization of same-sex sex behavior, sex work, and of drug use prevents people who are at risk of HIV or with HIV from accessing health care. It stops them from accessing prevention, testing, and treatment services. Current data shows that gay men and other men who have sex with men are 28 times more at risk of HIV than the general population. People who inject drugs, 22 times more at risk, and sex workers and transgender women, 13 times more at risk. The Joint UN Programme on HIV has for many years, quite rightly and consistently and in a principled way, called for these laws to be scrapped. So has the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, chaired by my distinguished Australian colleague, Justice Michael Kirby, first in 2012 and then in 2018. This afternoon, just downstairs, Goal 16 is being discussed. It talks beautifully, lyrically, of accessing public services, participating in public life, with freedoms of speech, association, and assembly, of eradicating violence. Again and again, though, we see that criminalized, marginalized, stigmatized communities have no realistic prospect of accessing or being embraced by these goals. UNAIDS data indicates that criminalized groups often experience higher rates of violence. If you suffer criminal violence and you are yourself also criminalized, in most cases you simply cannot go to the police. Should you do so, you risk at best bribery and corruption, at worst violence, including sexual violence. As human rights defenders, lawyers risk violence and repercussions if they seek to represent or to help you. Fundamental freedoms are denied. You can't form associations. Registering as a non-governmental organization is often not allowed. To my great pride, the courts of appeal in both Botswana and Kenya have recently required their governments to register LGBTI organizations, even though at that point, when the orders were given by the courts, same-sex sexual activity was still prohibited. Another decision by a full court of 3 judges of the High Court in Botswana recently struck down the prohibition. So there are positive movements, and yet sex workers can't unionize. They may not be able to participate in public life. and propaganda laws may inhibit the dissemination of information. The good news is that decriminalization really does work. Countries that decriminalize drug use, and we've got good instances, for instance, Portugal, and those that provide harm reduction see a drop in HIV infections. It's there, ladies and gentlemen, in the evidence. Evidence shows that decriminalizing sex work could avert between 33 and 46% of new HIV infections amongst sex workers and their clients over 10 years. And of course, it's not just the reduction in HIV infections. That is also a proxy indicator for the improvements in well-being, from being able to trust law enforcement, reducing violence, being able to access healthcare and support services, and above all, to no longer being seen as a criminalized, condemned, stigmatized, marginalized, rejected entity by society. The recent guidelines by UNDP, UNAIDS, and Essex University, which were launched in March this year on human rights and drug policy, identifies the harm to health of criminal laws and calls on states to consider decriminalization from the perspective of the right to health and other rights. Unless we incorporate action against criminal laws within Goal 10 and also Goal 16, we will simply not practically, feasibly be able to reach the goals on eradicating poverty and hunger, on health, education, gender equality, employment. And yet, and this is the sad tail end of my message, until now we've seen very little discussion on discriminatory laws at all, let alone criminal laws. In September, the Sustainable Development Agenda will be discussed at a high-level meeting here at the General Assembly. Recently, the draft political declaration for this meeting was released, yet it does not mention the word discrimination once. This is lamentable, ladies and gentlemen. It is correctable. The draft can be fixed. We have 11 more years until our target of 2030. We need to bring discrimination and decriminalization right to the head of the agenda, and together with that goal, bringing the criminalized and marginalized populations with it. Otherwise, we cannot achieve the lofty aspiration of leaving no one behind. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Great. Questions?
Justice Cameron, welcome to the United Nations. On behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, we appreciate your time and coming to speak with us. My name is Sherwin Bryce-P, South African Broadcasting. I have a couple of questions for you. What is the role of the rule of law in addressing economic exclusion, particularly when it comes to the question of access to drugs, particularly in the HIV/AIDS area? There's a drug currently on the market called Truvada that essentially reduces your ability to infect others by 98%. Essentially, it could stop.
And your own risk.
Yes.
It reduces your own susceptibility to HIV infection by over
right.
90%.
So basically the transmission would end
Yeah.
if everyone had access to these drugs. So can you just speak to that and the high cost of it? I think it's like $20,000 a year for a prescription, which really is very exclusionary. So what is the rule of law, the role of the rule of law in that regard? My second question is, can you talk about ending violence, promoting the rule of law, and strengthening institutions, increasing access to justice as it pertains to your own country, South Africa? Can you speak specifically to that? And tell us what you're going to do when you retire next month. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherwin. Let's start off with the role of the law in access to essential medicines and other drugs. We know that in all the major declarations of human rights, the right of access to health is part of it. So the law has a role, and rightfully so, because it is insupportable to talk about equality under the law and see it only in abstract equality terms. It's got to be a substantive, real form of equality, and that includes access to essential life-giving medicines and other forms of drugs. So correctly, the South African Constitution, like many other human rights declarations, embodies the right of access to health care. And you mentioned the case of Truvada, which to me as a self-identifying gay man, someone who is close to many men who have sex with men and who are at risk from HIV infection, more at risk because of simple physiological reasons, it's very important that these drugs should be made available. You also mentioned the question of cost, of course. Those drugs aren't as expensive to make as the figure that you mentioned. Of course, it's the patent system, intellectual property protections, which are also the consequence of legal systems and legal regimes that ought to be reconsidered and revised and modernized. And that will reduce the cost. We've seen it in Africa because of the intervention of treatment activists in North America, in Southern Africa, and eventually because of the intervention of the Clinton and Gates foundations. There was a radical reduction in the cost of antiretroviral medications in Africa in the early 2000s, making it possible for South Africa now to have the world's largest publicly provided publicly provided antiretroviral treatment program. So it can be done, and you're right to raise the issue. The second one that you ask about South Africa is, of course, a very easy question about the role of the law and violence in South Africa. Can you just give me something more specific about it? Was there anything within that vast field of easy answers that you would like to know specifically about?
South Africa is a very violent society.
Yes.
So, I'm asking you to sort of present a few solutions. What do you make, having sat on the highest court for a number of on various levels of the judiciary? What's your sense? These are cases that often come before the judiciary. How does South Africa do better at implementing SDG 16?
Let me say some practical things. On the 20th of August, I will reach the 25th year of my appointment as a judge, which is also the date on which I'm stepping down. And what I can say is that the degradation of independent institutions in our country over the last 9 years undoubtedly affected law enforcement. We had degradation of crime intelligence, degradation of the independent prosecuting authority, degradation of the police at the top ranks. It enfeebled and affected law enforcement throughout. What we do know as judges and law enforcement officials is that abstract policies, grand visions, laws, we've got lots of those in South Africa. If there's an issue, we in South Africa have known over the last 25 years of democracy how to throw laws and policies at it. What we need in South Africa is application. We know that harsh sentences do not deter crime. What does deter crime is the certainty of detection, arraignment, and prosecution. It's not high sentences. So if we in South Africa can get our law enforcement agencies, crime intelligence agencies, CID agencies back operating again, and I do believe we can because we have a president who's committed to social justice, a president who's committed to a functioning, disinterested bureaucracy and government services, I believe that we can reduce crime. And I think it's a practicable result. But of course, it takes a lot of institutional work. There's no magical answer, but it can be done with a lot of hard work from all of us. I hope to stay busy. And I've got friends who have plans to keep me busy. Yes. But there's nothing formal. I hope to write more. I hope to teach more. And I already have a program of quite intensive commitments stretching to the end of next year. So I certainly won't be idle. I won't be sitting on a beach. Thank you. Maybe not so sad.
There will be some rest in there somewhere, hopefully.
There will.
Any further questions? Comments? Any parting thoughts?
Can I just say that I sat yesterday in the discussion of SDG 10, and it was a moving session because there were many formal statements with a lot of substantive content in the formal statements, but there were also very moving statements by non-governmental groups, by individual groups, by law enforcement groups, by corporate and other groups. And it's important that we translate the aspirations and the understandings and the insights that happen in this forum into people's lives. And there are things that we can do. I know in my own lifetime, as a person and as a lawyer, what the abolition of criminal prohibitions in South Africa on racial neighborhoods, cross-racial relationships and sex, on men who have sex with men and gay men and LGBTI people. We've seen the great benefits that those have brought in terms of inclusiveness, human productivity, human dignity. And I think that a practical thing that can emerge from these discussions this week is a focus on decriminalizing. The criminal law is a great thing. It's a useful thing. It is a protective thing. It embodies society's aspirations to express itself effectively against antisocial behavior. But when misused, as it is against people who use drugs, people who offer sexual services for reward, men who have sex with men, women seeking reproductive services, people living with HIV who are severely targeted in my continent. In all of those cases, it's a distortion of the criminal law. And really, it's a message of hope that there is something constructive we can do. We've got the evidence. We've got the examples of countries where it's happened. So that's the upbeat note I'd like to end on.
Good. And if I may be so impertinent, I'd like to just issue a bit of a challenge to the UN correspondents to say that I think central to a lot of what Justice Cameron has talked about and the success of the HIV response today is the role of civil society and human rights organizations in particular. And I think the correspondents should be tracking very carefully what is happening around the world with regard to crackdowns on civil society and shrinking civic space. It may not be exactly on point in terms of the HIV issue specifically, but it runs through SDG 10, SDG 16, SDG 3. It's really central to so much of what Agenda 2030 and the SDGs aspire to. So I hope that you're going to be keeping an eye on what's happening around the world with human rights organizations and civil society organizations. It is not a good time for many of them right now. And at the United Nations, we need to speak up for that.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm sure that that as a judge, I would never dream in a UN forum of mentioning actual examples, Mandeep.
No.
But there are prominent Indian human rights lawyers whom I'm sure you didn't have in mind, but I will bring them into the discussion. Anand Grover and Indira Jai Singh, who I know from personal experience, who brought me to India to advocate human rights causes, and who I think have felt, I know you didn't mean to mention them at all, but I would like to mention them, and I hope that the media will follow what is happening in India in the way in which they are being targeted.
Thank you.